Good evening, everybody, for the main part of the presentation with Andy Mayo from HoverAid. We will have a presentation followed by a question and answer session. Okay, Andy, over to you.
Thanks, Alan. Really appreciate it. And first of all, thank you everybody for attending. I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all. Obviously, an august and influential body, and also one with a significant amount of experience when it comes to the hover element of HoverAid. I know that you're all very interested in finding out more about what we've been doing and what we are planning to do in the future. What I want to do before we do that is talk a little bit about the aid side of HoverAid so that you can see it in context. We've already seen a bit of that with the video that we've just seen. And that video, I think, gives a pretty good impression of the sort of environment that we're working in. So let's move on through. We'll talk about that a little bit in a minute. So first of all, before we get any further, what is HoverAid and where have we come from? Well, HoverAid started in Chad in 1967. Then there were a series of expeditions to Nepal, Peru, and China using the prototype River Rover hovercraft, which was designed by Tim Longley. And I've put these bits in blue because technically, well, this isn't really HoverAid. This is the backstory to HoverAid. HoverAid itself was set up in 1991 with an expedition to Papua New Guinea, with the first of the Mark IV River Rovers, building on the experience that was gathered, and with many of the same people who've been involved in these expeditions previously. 2 River Rover Mark IVs went to Papua New Guinea, one went to Zambia in 1995, and another one went to Nicaragua in 1995, it was called a Mark V hovercraft, but it was a Mark IV. It had a different engine in it. That was the only difference. So we've allowed it to remain being called a Mark V, and it will do that for perpetuity. And when we go to the next Mark, it'll be a Mark VI. We then did work in Mozambique doing flood relief. Many of you may remember that in the year 2000, a series of 4 cyclones hit Mozambique. And to be brutally honest, there wasn't an awful lot a lot of newsworthy stuff happening in the rest of the world. So it got the world's attention, and I knew that we got a hovercraft sitting in Zambia that could do a lot of good. So I went out, we moved it to Mozambique, and in concert with a number of other organizations, we reached about 10,000 people that other people simply couldn't reach. DFID sent out Lancaster Fire Brigade, who were using Zodiac boats. And the big problem there was that they were getting about 1 journey per engine. They had Mercury engines out there, and the water was chocolatey thick, very, very hot, and the engines simply couldn't cope and overheated, whereas the hovercraft was absolutely fine. We did more work in Malawi in cyclone relief again in 2001, and I've put 07 in for Mozambique because we did more work there with Oxfam in 2007. And then on the back of all of that, the green section there essentially relates to HoverAid as a volunteer organisation. And the blue bit at the bottom, Madagascar, we went full-time in 2006, and 15 years later, we're still there. And we have a team, I think at the moment, it's about 18 out in Madagascar, all Malagasy, apart from Peter, who saw the Dutch guy, who he's Dutch, but he considers himself to be part of the furniture in Madagascar now. Now, very briefly, let's put this into context. I just want to quickly go over the first 6 United Nations Sustainable Development Goals and what are seen as being the key things that are supposed to be available for everybody according to the Sustainable Development Goals. We've got the elimination of poverty, elimination of hunger, healthy lives and well-being for all, education for all, gender equality and empowerment for all women and girls, and water and sanitation for all. Now, those are the first 6 of, I think, now 17 Sustainable Development Goals, and the target for those was 2030. The current estimate is that, for example, with poverty, 7% of the world will remain in poverty in the year 2030. So we're a way off meeting these goals, and we're not going to hit them by 2030. The most important point I want to make about these is that these are universal. These are not, we want to reduce the amount of poverty by 60% or something like that. We want to eliminate 30% of hunger. These are universal, And I think it's reasonable to say that these seem like a good idea. And I think that's why they have been generally adopted around the world. So what do we do? Well, our mission statement is using Hovercraft to establish connection with isolated individuals and communities that fosters healthy growth. And in a little bit more detail, what the output of that actually looks like is the medical teams that you saw, relief work, community health programs, schools building, environmental surveys, and advocacy. The medical teams, we take teams of doctors out. We've got a roster of about 60 doctors now in Madagascar, and they donate their time, they volunteer their time, the Malagasy doctors, and we take them out safely into the remote communities. We actually own a lot of the medical equipment, so we've got anaesthetic equipment, we've got heart monitors, sonar, I've forgotten the words. A lot of the monitoring and equipment that's needed during operations. So we can actually take a team out into the field and do full-on operations, everything from tumor resections, amputations, lots and lots of dental work, all that sort of stuff. So our job is to enable the doctors to do that. Relief work happens regularly. Madagascar is the most cyclone-prone country in Africa, possibly in the world, but certainly well up there. Typically, it'll get between 3 and 4 significant cyclones every year. Community health programs, this is where I like to say that the rubber hits the road, but really it's the rubber hits the water, because in doing preventative and upstream work, you're able to get rid of downstream problems. So things like mosquito net distribution, water and sanitation programs, we do well digging projects. Schools buildings, that's become something that we've done more of now. So where there is an existing school, by which I mean a group of people meeting under a tree, and there are motivated parents or teachers in the community, then we will try to enable them by actually physically building buildings. What we won't do is go and build a building just because someone says we want a school. We will work with the local community to ensure that what they are doing is supported. Environmental surveys, we work with another NGO called Impact Madagascar, who do a lot of work on the ecology and the environment in Madagascar. Obviously, Madagascar is an environmental hotspot. One thing you may not know, Madagascar is 93% deforested. And this is one of the reasons why the rivers are choked and full of silt and sand, is because a lot of material from the high plateau at 4,500 feet has washed down onto the low plateau. And I'll show you a little bit more about that later. And then advocacy, well, frankly, that's what I'm doing now. I'm telling you a bit about Madagascar and trying to engage you with the issues of the Malagasy people. What are our challenges? Well, we use Hovercraft, which are an esoteric technology. They're not something I can simply go down the road and buy easily. There are lots of different hovercraft that have been created and built for lots of different specific environments. What we've discovered is that the environment that we operate in doesn't really have very many people who have enough money to buy a hovercraft. And so consequently, the market forces have not driven manufacturers to produce hovercraft that are tuned specifically to the regions that we work in. Secondly, we work in a country that very few people know about. When you ask people about Madagascar, typically what will come up is the ecology or the environment. People may have seen the movies, so they may think that Madagascar is covered in jungle, which it isn't. They may talk about David Attenborough and the old movies about the giant birds that were there, which are no longer there, pygmy elephants, the eye, things like that. Or alternatively, they may talk about Grand Tour, which is the most recent popular program that went to Madagascar and did very clearly demonstrate how difficult it is to get around. But that's the sort of limit. Very few people, for example, would know that there are 26 million people living in Madagascar, that it's the size of the UK and Germany combined, that it is one of the poorest nations on the planet. And for example, there's a great thing, the World Bank has a thing called the Rural Access Index, which is the proportion of the population in a country who live within 2 kilometers of an all-weather road. And Madagascar has the lowest value for this in Africa. 11% of Madagascar's rural population live within 2 kilometers of a road that is accessible and usable all year round. So the vast majority are living way off in very inaccessible areas. And then our third problem, and this may look very odd, our donors are not our beneficiaries. What I mean by that is, if HoverAid were a heart charity or a cancer charity, there is a possibility that you might have a heart problem or get cancer. And so you might be prepared to give to support HoverAid because you might become a beneficiary in the future. Very, very few people, in fact, I don't think a single one of our donors is likely to become Malagasy or live in a remote part of Madagascar. What do we do about that? Well, we design and build hovercraft that suit our own needs, in answer to the first question. In answer to the second one, we tell people about Madagascar. And in answer to the third one, we seek to build metaphorical bridges to expand the moral community. Now, I don't expect any of you to pick up on that straight away, but I'm going to try and explore each of these three solutions in turn. We'll start with the last one because it's possibly the oddest. So our worldview is one of rights and justice, which is essentially everyone is deserving of help. HoverAid is a Christian charity, and so love your neighbor as yourself is very definitely a message that speaks to us. However, Immanuel Kant picked up on this, and he referred to it as deontological contractarianism, which essentially means that people have reciprocal rights and responsibilities. And all of those things that we looked at the beginning from the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, they're essentially rights. The view is that people should have a right to healthcare. They should have a right to clean water. They should have a right to equality based on gender or any other particular section within society. So all of these things can be cast as rights, and everyone is therefore deserving of help to achieve those rights for a just society. And the way that rights and obligations reflect one another is within what we call a moral community. So if you sense that someone is like you, you expect them to respect you and to speak to you or to treat you in the way that you will treat them, because you are within the same moral community. And therefore, what we are trying to do is to enable people, for example, in Europe, in the UK, in Germany, in America, in the Netherlands, and in France, to see themselves in the people that we are meeting in Madagascar. It's about that sense of we are all in this together. And then equally, we are all in this together in the sense of the environment, and certainly global warming is an issue that affects all of us. So we're all in that together. The alternative viewpoint is pragmatism, which is helping as many people as possible. And that's, from a philosophical perspective, referred to as utilitarianism, which is the greatest good for the greatest number. Now, question, why have I put a Land Cruiser in that image? The simple answer is this. If you guys are Oxfam and I give you £1, you have a moral obligation, in fact, you've got a duty of care, to spend that pound in the most effective way that you can. And so what you will do is you will do things that you know work, you will do things that you know are within your power to achieve, you will do things that will compete well with CARE and CAFOD and Save the Children and World Vision and Action Aid and Christian Aid, all the other large NGOs who are all operating in the same environment. And you will do the thing that will bring about the largest amount of good with the resources that you have, because you need to report back to your supporters, look how many people we've helped. Joseph Stalin had something really interesting to say about this. He basically said that 1 death is a tragedy, 1 million deaths is a statistic. Now, where this reflects back in the NGO sector is very simple. If you are a very large NGO, what you will do is reach the low-hanging fruit. You will go to where you know you can go, and a Land Cruiser is a phenomenal piece of equipment. There have been many, many millions of them built, which means that they are refined technology. They work. You can get parts for them. You can guess how much it's, or you can plan for how much it's going to cost you to operate over the year. You can drive it home. You can give it to your country director or to any of his subordinates so that they can drive it home as a status symbol. You can sit in your Land Cruiser and drive to a remote community in an air-conditioned musical environment, so that you're in your office, you're in a safe space. If things go wrong, you can get back in your Land Cruiser and you can go away. They're very robust, very reliable, and they work really well. The consequence of that is that Oxfam, World Vision, Save the Children, Tear Fund, CAFOD, CARE, Action Aid, Islamic Relief, all make essentially the same utilitarian decision. And what that does is it systematically excludes those who are more difficult to reach. If you can't be reached by a Land Cruiser, the probability of an NGO coming to help you is radically lower, ridiculously lower. We know that because we're going to areas of Madagascar, we've been to areas of Papua New Guinea and Zambia, where you can't get there in a 4x4, but there are still people living there. People live where there is water, first and foremost. So that's the alternative viewpoint. And as I said, HoverAid's viewpoint is one that everyone's deserving of help. We're able to have that viewpoint because we're small, we're nimble, and we're filling the niches that the larger organizations are unable to fill. Now, second then, we work in a country few people know about, so we tell people about Madagascar. So let me tell you a bit about Madagascar. This is Madagascar. On the left, you can see the road network. On the right-hand side, you can see the river network. And I think what's pretty obvious is that the river network is larger than the road network. Those red roads, those are the all-weather roads. The ones that are in yellow are not available all year round. Many of them are only available part of the year round. And certainly for many of those, you need a very good 4x4 in order to be able to get around. Now, the area that we work in is predominantly this area on the the western side, the low plateau. This area in the middle is a high plateau. It's up at around about 4,500 feet, and the rivers drop down, and you can see that there's a watershed running along the middle of the country here, and that the rivers then run out, heading to the west. So this area here is typically at around about 100, 200 meters elevation. So you've got very low falls and very shallow rivers. So this is an aerial shot of the Mangoki River. And this is a map of the Mangoki River and showing the major tributaries coming in and out of it. This is our base at River Rover, which was talked about in the little movie. And we can operate all the way up and down this river. And there are, on the Mangoki at the moment, we believe there are of the order of about 170,000 people living just on that one river system. And these tributaries are often very narrow, very windy, and in parts of the dry season can be kilometers of dry riverbed before you come back to a water surface. So you can end up with a gap in the water between the main river and the tributary because the water starts to flow below the surface. I just put this in for reference. This is the local district health post, I suppose you could call it that, in Berua, and their map. Now, what's interesting about this is that their conception of distance is based on how long it takes to get from one place to another. So these distances do not map to our geographical map. What's clear is it takes a very, very, very long time to get up to Antananarivo up here in the northeast. It can take up to 2 weeks to walk that. This is the health post that you might be presented with when you get to one of those remote villages. This is a fridge that would have been donated probably back in the 1970s. It's a kerosene fridge using an ammonia cycle. They've never had any kerosene in them. They're used as cupboards. When I looked on the thermometer on the outside of it, I seem to remember it said 38 degrees. So the needs are great. There has been hope in the past. People have built buildings, huts, and there is some degree of bureaucracy. But the simple fact is there are no doctors. This kiddie came to us, he'd got advanced tuberculosis. This kid came to us suffering from malaria. We were able to do something about the malaria. There wasn't anything we could do about the TB. Let me just show you these. So this is a recent data set that we collected from a medical safari. We call them medical safaris because we're going out into the bush. And what you can see is the number of patients and the age distribution that's going on here. So we've kind of got a peak in around the 30s to 40s area of people who have issues that need dealing with, and also a peak in the lower section here. What isn't obvious from this is the median age in Madagascar is 16. Half the population is below the age of 16. You can also see from this the range of things that we're dealing with here. So everything from tuners, obs and gynae stuff, orthopedic and plastic surgeries or broken legs, we'll come on to that in a moment, general surgery, which that can be all sorts of different things, ear, nose and throat stuff. Dental, we've actually done a lot more dental work. Dental work's it's a really good one to do because you can get into a location quickly, you can whip out some teeth, and people who've been in absolute agony are no longer in agony. Whereas if we're trying to do stuff that requires a lot more aftercare, then that becomes rather more complicated, especially if we're visiting an area we're not going to be back there for 6 months. So we have to do doctoring in a different way from the way that it gets done in the UK. But this is just typical. So this is Dr. Fanan. We take him out. This chap had an ulcerated foot. I can't remember exactly what was up with this particular chap, but the fact was that he was able to talk to Fanan because Fanan is Malagasy, whereas our French-speaking doctors wouldn't have been able to talk to the patients in the same way. You saw a bit of this operation earlier on. This was a cleft lip operation that was going on. Little kiddie called Farah, and he and his family had been excluded from the village on the basis that he and his sister, actually his younger sister, both had cleft lips. This was deemed to be an indication that they were demon possessed, and the consequence of that was that they and their entire family were excluded from the village. The operation was done, and then a couple of years later, this is Farah, same kid, beautiful smile, and he and his family have been accepted back into the village. Now, the fact that we've corrected his smile is great. The fact that he now has a future because he and his family are accepted back into the community is in some ways the bigger outcome from this. I'll whip through this one quickly, and if you're squeamish, please look away now. So this was a kid who came to us with gangrene. He'd, I think, broken his leg chasing a pig, and we amputated his leg, and he made a full recovery. We were able to, this is actually a fiberglass leg that we had made for him up in Tana that was taken out, and he and his young family are thriving to this day. We do stay in touch with Harry. So the final one, we come back to Hovercraft, which are an esoteric technology, and we design and build one that suits our needs. Now, the big problem for engineers is that engineers have a habit of solving problems rather than engaging with issues. So it's very easy for us to become focused on technical parameters, whereas sustainable development ultimately is people focused. And we learned this to our cost. So one of the things that we've really got as a big feather in our cap as HoverAid is that we've made more mistakes with HoverAid, with Hovercraft, and we've broken more Hovercraft than probably any other organization on the planet. We have learned the hard way that providing a solution and simply taking it somewhere doesn't work. We've learned the hard way that providing a solution and making it possible for other organizations just to come and get on it won't work, because you've then got to affect their institutions and norms and behaviors. We've discovered that Hovercraft that we might work in Nicaragua at sea level struggle when you move them to Zambia at 4,500 feet and 40 degrees. We've discovered that if you have a hovercraft that is a monocoque construction made out of fiberglass, however light you try to make it, it's not as robust as one that is made out of aluminium parts that can bend and break. That's maybe a slightly controversial point, but that's our experience. So in order to solve these things, we have to engage with the people on the ground. And that is really important. The tricky bit about sustainability is rights and power. we need to make sure that the people who are influencing the design of our hovercraft as engineers are the people who are going to use it, the people who are going to own it. And I don't mean that in the sense that they pay for it. I mean in the sense that they identify themselves with that hovercraft. They are the ones who are invested in it. Many of us have come from or still are hovercraft enthusiasts. We love these things. They are, as we all know, Jeremy Clarkson said, the most fun you can possibly have with a petrol engine. I would suggest they're also the most fun you can have with a diesel engine, because that's what we use. However, it also means that we have a sense of ownership of the hovercraft. This only works if the people who are going to use the hovercraft, i.e. those in Madagascar, also have that sense of ownership. Humility isn't something we embrace easily, and it's very easy for us to assume that we know best. So, in order for this development to be sustainable, we need to focus on people, motivations, and, as I said, ownership. And I've just highlighted these 4 likely characters: Johnny, Jose, Mahuli, and Patrick. They are 4 of our team in Madagascar. Johnny is one of our mechanics. His background, he was a fisherman, one of the Vezo tribe, who are boat users on the west coast. And then they're seen as a slightly separate group from the rest of the Malagasys. However, the big important thing is Johnny knows the tides and the currents and the vagaries of the Malagasy weather systems like nobody else on this earth. He just knows it, he understands it, he gets it. And so the fact that he is now a hovercraft pilot as well means that he is able to bring his specific skill set to what we are doing. Jose, another one of our drivers, brilliant 4x4 driver, being able to drive the hovercraft on a trailer behind a Land Cruiser. We actually had to build the trailer specifically. It's not just the hovercraft, it's the hovercraft plus the trailer, plus all the attendant kit that has to go with it, plus the Land Cruiser that's got to end up 400 or 500 kilometers into the bush. And that means that you need to have feedback from the guys who are getting it there. Now, Jose is also one of our hovercraft pilots. So he is, in some ways, one of the best able to help us define what the hovercraft's got to be able to do, not just in terms of it being a hovercraft, but it being a lump that that travels around on the back of a trailer. Specifically a trailer where the bed is, I think I'm right in saying it's about 1.5 meters off the ground, so that it's got sufficient clearance to get over the obstacles that we see. It's not a low riding trailer at all. Mahuli runs our medical programs. She's absolutely brilliant. She knows what the doctors need. She knows what they need out of the hovercraft. So she's able to feed that back in. And Patrick's our chief mechanic. He's Toyota trained. There is very little that he can't do to fix an engine. So he's part of our design team. When we are having design team meetings, Patrick is part of that. And I've literally been discussing with him over the last 2 days differences or changes that we need to make to a drive shaft element, because he's the guy who's actually got to fix it. He's got to put it in. However, she is the stakeholder that we have to take the most notice of. One of the reasons is she's female, which means that she's talking to lots of people in the village. She's old, which means she survived and therefore knows what goes on in the village. She is going to have huge amounts of insight into what we are trying to do, what's going to work, what doesn't work, what seasons are going to be the best season for us to work in a location. So in terms of stakeholders, it's the people actually at the sharp end, living in these remote communities, who we have to really include in our design decisions. Now, I'm going to move on from the aid and development talk, and let's plow into some hovercraft stuff now. You've seen what the River Rover Mark IV looks like. You've heard that we are building a new River Rover. We're calling this the River Rover Mark IV-B. What we are essentially trying to do is regain the capacity that HoverAid had back in the 1990s, which is the ability to produce hovercraft, and also to build partnership arrangements and to bring about, to incorporate all the things that we've learned over 25 years of breaking these things. So let's just briefly talk through how the River Rover works. It's an aluminium framework bolted together that sits around a series of repeating fiberglass sections. So Keith Smallwood at Vortex has been making these up for us. These are composite, but they're not thick section composite, they are thin section composite. And they're also vinyl ester rather than polyester, so that we've got increased strength. And we're getting the benefits of the lightness that we can get from the racing community, but we're also getting the robustness that we've learned actually works by having the aluminium framework around it, which is a remarkably efficient structure actually. At the back here, I'm just showing some of the transmission and the fans. So we have a centrifugal clutch. This area is where the engine sits, cardan shaft, a lift fan that dumps down into this area here, which is our plenum. This is a pretty horrible turn for that fan to be going through. So as you'll see later, we've got some analysis that's been going on and that we're engaging in at the moment in how we can improve the airflows in the system at the moment. We have all three fans running direct connected. So a single transmission shaft running through, belt drives off either side, and different fans, different blade configurations to optimize for lift and for thrust, and flow straightening on both lift and thrust. You'd be surprised how much of a difference putting a stator section behind the lift rotor can make. And then these items over here, some of you may know about the River Rover. We use elevons as well as rudders. And obviously this is reflected over on the other side here. You'll see that in the next slide. Actually, the slide after next. The elevons enable us very specifically to bank the craft, roll it essentially, rather than just having the yaw capability that you get from rudders. Most hovercrafters are aware of the advantages you get from having rudders and an elevator, especially if you have a single fan in the back for pitch control, for trim. But because we've got two elevons and the elevons are independently controlled, that means that we've got good authority over pitch, yaw, and roll. And it means that we can fly the hovercraft in a way which is a little different from the majority of hovercraft. And we can therefore fly with a more tapered skirt, a higher skirt, if you like, that's quasi-unstable, and because we can actively roll the craft into a turn. And that gives us really good maneuverability, pinpoint maneuverability, and it enables us to get up the twisty, turny rivers that we need to get up. It's a specific thing that we've pursued with HoverAid. We've tried going to single fans. We've got a Griffin 375 out in Madagascar as well. We have a Vortex 5 out in Madagascar. Our experience has been that the twin fan configuration, we know it's not as efficient, but it does the job that we need it to do. Just a little breakdown here. So this is one of our thrust boxes, an exploded view. So you can see there are a lot of components going into these things. And that's one of the downsides. It's not an easy thing to manufacture a River Rover. The point was the River Rover design has not been optimized for mass manufacture. It's been designed for cheap manufacture. Ultimately, our aim is to be able to build out in Madagascar or out in Papua New Guinea or in Zambia, essentially from a kit of parts. But to get to that point, we've got to build one down in a barn in Sussex, and that's what we're doing at the moment. And then this is the final solid model. So you can see what the layout is. It's a 6-seater. The nice thing about the modular arrangement is it's relatively straightforward for us to stretch this or to widen it. It's really easy for us to do that. So the future versions and variants that will come out of this process, the Mark 6 onwards, we will be able to tune to the different requirements we have in different areas. Certainly, we've got the capability out of Madagascar to transport a hovercraft that's another 2 bays longer than this. So that would basically add an extra bay in this area here. The engine that's going into here, we're doing a lot of work at the moment with some of our partners. I'll come on to those in a minute, about engine selection, engine cooling, vibrational analysis on the engine, because all of these things have caused us to come a cropper in the past. Another thing you might notice, I'm just showing this indicatively here, fuel tank here, we have 2 fuel tanks, one here and one at the centre of mass, and we can pump fuel fore and aft, which helps us with our trimming, and that gives us a duration, maximum duration of 8 hours, and a typical sortie duration we would plan for would be 6 hours, with using 25% as our reserve. You know, if you get becalmed, or not becalmed, if you get under hump in the wrong position, something goes wrong, you need to make sure you've got a reserve to be able to get you somewhere safely. So our target is always arrive back with 1 hour to spare and 25% of your fuel. And that's the reality. Now, the weird thing is that in a way, we're kind of back engineering the thing that we did before. When the Mark IV was designed in the first place, I'm just going to flick through a few shots here so you can see it in context. It was designed with Manchester University, with Queen Mary College in London, and a lot of work was done early on CAD. One of the problems that we had was that in the intervening period, those CAD drawings all got lost. They were on discs that were in people's lofts, and there were lightning strikes that formatted the discs. They were in all sorts of different CAD formats. So I've actually had an archaeological experience for about 3 years going through and rebuilding all the CAD information that we had. We've also got tools and jigs, so picking up information that was embodied in those tools and jigs, so that we're getting ourselves to a point where we can now produce this. I won't go through this in great detail, but what I just want to show is that we have engaged in this development process in what we believe to be the correct way for prototyping at this stage rather than manufacturing. Our plan at this stage is to build 1, possibly 2 of the River Rover Mark IVBs, get those out to Madagascar, and then our growth process with HoverAid is we want to go back to Zambia, we want to expand into Papua New Guinea. Overall, our plan is 10 vehicles in 10 years. But I just wanted to show that, you know, that there are a series of steps to this, and at the moment we're in this area here. So we're in between the detailed design and the manufacturer. Another way of putting that is we're in the phony war. We've got a whole load of parts that are being manufactured at the moment by partners, and they will be arriving soon, and we'll start the assembly. Our plan is that we will have our hovercraft out in Madagascar by the end of 2022, and it will be operational at least early 2023. Our partnership strategy, I just want to talk this through a little bit because I want to say thank you and recognise some of our partners. So Cambridge University, Ricardo, MathsWorks or Simulink, Onshape, Ansys and Produmax are some of the partners that we've got. Our approach is simply this. We want to use low-skilled labour where it's appropriate, and that's basically the assembly, because the River Rover is an IKEA flat-pack hovercraft, for want of a better analogy. It's something that should be really simple to put together. But to get to that point, we've got to have a lot of high-tech input, we've got to have a lot of good design analysis, and we've also got to have part manufacture that's done as cheaply and as straightforwardly as possible. So, for example, Cambridge University, we've now got 4th year students working on projects for us. We had some 1st and 2nd year students over the summer building a skirt for us down in the workshop down in Sussex. The part of the process of this is the guys at Cambridge University understanding what all the issues are that are to do with hovercraft, because they haven't been involved in that sort of thing for a long time. Am I right in thinking that Laurie Doctor is with us this evening? Because the 4th year project that we've got going on at the moment is looking at wave profiles from skirt drag and doing a compare and contrast with the analytical process that Laurie produced, and putting that into either a CFD or a spherical particle hydrodynamics analysis system, which is like CFD, but the cells are unconstrained, so they can move around, in order to see whether or not the computational approaches that we've got these days match up with the analytic approach that was taken beforehand. Ansys, we're getting support from Ansys, looking at fluid flow. So this is a radiator section where we're actually trying to optimize the cooling We're doing 0D and 1D modeling on the cooling systems, and then we're also doing this, which is 4D modeling. Produmax make parts for Boeing 787s. They are producing the aluminium parts, or a whole load of the aluminium parts for us. So this is part of a corporate social responsibility setup. We're very, very grateful to them that they're helping us. And one of the advantages of this is that they're able to train some of their apprentices on doing things that are going to have real benefit out in the real world. Now, where I wanted to finish with this was to show you this other movie, the one that doesn't have sound. So I'm going to try and get that one up and running. Hopefully, you guys can now see a just kill the sound, because otherwise I'm going to deafen myself. If I just play this video through, hopefully it's self-explanatory, and it will show you a little bit of what it is we're doing. So there's our aluminium frame that we start with. A whole series of side decks, those can fold down, which enables the craft to be trailed. And then we've got some composite hull tubs that sit into that. Transmission, which are agricultural parts, HTD belts, all off the shelf. London Fan Company fans and some multi-wing fans. The elevons at the back, which we had patents for. We can talk about airlift hovercraft if you want. So those are our thrust ducts. Those entire thrust ducts are removed for transportation. We want a free engine. Doesn't look like we're going to get one, but we're working with Ricardo on the engine selection, and we're getting 10 Ricardo apprentices working with us. Fuel tanks sit in it. Fuel tanks and batteries for center of mass issues. We're going to move those batteries further back. Gull wing doors, glass windows so that they don't deteriorate. The skirt, which is an HTD, an HDL type skirt, open loop and segment. And then I put this in because this is some nice footage of the hovercraft working, which we happen to have from a drone. It's not at real speed in some parts, which is a bit annoying. And it also only has shots of the hovercraft going relatively slowly because we were doing some fairly careful maneuvering to get past this particular village. And that's a shot of the hovercraft sliding sideways, which was terribly fun, but is actually very poor driving. I'm just going to leave these statements up here for you to read. So chaps, thank you very much for your time. I know we're now at 5 minutes past 9, but I'm sure there will be some questions. I've gone on and on and on. So I think it's now time. Alan, do you want to throw the floor open to other people to interrogate me?
Excuse me, just unmuting. Thank you very much indeed, Andy. Just to allow for freedom of expression, I will now stop the recording, and we can go into a discussion session. So I will stop that now.